Episode 10, C.S. Lewis and the Most Oppressive of Tyrannies.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words and letting it all behind. I'm coming up from underneath the red, from underneath the pain.
Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I will be discussing C.S. Lewis and something he referred to as the most oppressive of tyrannies. But before we begin, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button on whatever podcast you're using, so not to miss any future episodes. And if you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, and YouTube. And if you're enjoying the podcast, let me and other listeners know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, and I'll read it on the show. Also, please consider supporting us with a one-time or monthly donation through Patreon. Visit the support tab on anarchochristian.com. It will take you to the Patreon page where you'll find a few ways to support us. And one more update. PorkFest is coming up next month, and I'm very excited to be recording a Q&A on Saturday morning. So if you're attending, or if you're just in the area, stop in, say hi, and I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, now full disclosure, I love C.S. Lewis. Everything from his children's books to his apologetics, his Narnia series, and the Screwtape Letters are wonderful, and his nonfiction like Mere Christianity and The Problem of Pain are, in my opinion, must-reads. There are a few different topics we could go over concerning Lewis and liberty, but today I'd like to visit a comment that is political and I think is truly timeless in that regard. But first, a little backstory on Lewis, in case you're not familiar with him. He was born in 1898 and died in 1963, coincidentally, the same day as the JFK assassination. The world lost two historically influential people that day, and it really is a shame that Lewis's death seems to be forever overshadowed by the JFK assassination. But he spent his early life as an atheist, and he became a theist and then a Christian in his early 30s. I think we're going to have a ton of opportunities to get into more of his biography, as he's contributed so much to the faith and reason and logic and apologetics. But again, I want to focus on one of the things that he said that's especially of interest to us while we consider Christianity and the state. So, nearly a decade after he died, a book of essays and speeches that he gave was published, and it was titled God in the Dock. It's a great book, though it's not usually one of the first books listed as a must-read of Lewis's. But posthumous compilations rarely are. But again, we can usually find a lot of great little insights and great nuggets of information in those sorts of compilations. It's very similar to something that we saw in the Tolkien episode a little while back, where he had such an amazing critique on Christianity and politics found in a letter that Tolkien wrote to his son, rather than a treatise that he wrote at the height of his professorship. And I think I might have noted this in the Tolkien episode too, that Lewis and Tolkien were friends while they were professors, even meeting at a local pub for their literary group, the Inklings, where they share writings and other things that they were working on. I can't even imagine how cool that would be to see that just once. But the title God in the Dock is referencing where we seem to place God today, on trial, rather than his creation standing before him, a sovereign and holy God. We now place him under trial, facing our judgment. And this is obviously in line with the sort of rationalism and logic that we've come to expect from Lewis. It's why I love his writing so much. He has this way of flipping your perspective and pointing out the obvious that we have trouble seeing ourselves. So this statement in God in the Dock is very similar, but pertaining to governance rather than apologetics. It is found in the essay The Humanitarian Theory of Punishment. In it, Lewis observes motives behind certain punishments. He wrote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive." I love that quote. That's something that I think that all of us should tuck away, maybe not memorize word for word, but just keep that general idea tucked away and use that in a lot of your conversations pertaining to anarchism and statism. But we're such social do-gooders today. I'm not sure if most of society would see why this is such a profoundly important statement. But he goes further in the essay to illustrate exactly what he's talking about. It would be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep. His cupidity may at some point be satiated. But those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. They may be more likely to go to heaven, yet at the same time likelier to make a hell of earth. This very kindness stings with intolerable insult. To be cured against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason, or those who never will, to be classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. So there's a lot to unpack here. The first statement really says it all. It makes for the best meme or the quick soundbite. Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. But what most people don't get here is when you are putting yourself in a position to make someone act or to keep someone from acting against their will, you are being a tyrant. You are being a slave master. And what Lewis is postulating is that it may be even worse than just overtly enslaving for your own benefit. Enslaving someone else for their benefit may be worse. I think it's worth asking how this is. Why may it be worse? It seems to be the same outcome, essentially enslavement, if you really boil it down. But let's look at the illustrations to see why he says this. Lewis uses the term robber barons. Robber barons is a somewhat outdated term from the times of feudalism, but mostly it's used now with some of the biggest names in early American industry, titans of steel and newspaper, railroads, oil and banking businesses like Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, and Hearst all make this list of robber barons today. And robber barons were men that achieved their fortune through unethical or perceived unethical or ruthless means. And of course, each of the names I just mentioned have been associated with all manner of collusion and underhanded strategies in their businesses. So, moving on, Lewis says it would be better to live under these guys than under omnipotent moral busybodies. I think it would be fair to call this subjective, but also fair to imagine what is he referring to. It's really easy to brush past words. What was an omnipotent busybody? Of course, I think the term omnipotent should be recognized and important to Christians. It's generally a theological term that we reserve for God. Omnipotence referring to God's characteristic of being all-powerful. So Lewis holds two options for us to consider: a ruthless, selfish robber baron, or a person that meddles in someone else's life with the arrogance of putting their knowledge on par with God's. Of course, they would probably shake their head if you asked, do you think you're omnipotent? And they would say no, but this claim is more for the appearance or the subconscious, not for the omnipotent busybody to agree. No one is going to say, yeah, I'm an omnipotent busybody. So I'm not going to give necessarily my opinions on every scenario that we could think of between our two rulers that Lewis has given us, imagining the worst stories I've ever heard about Rockefeller or Carnegie or Hearst, or imagining the worst neighbor that I've ever had that was always snooping on other neighbors or something like that. I think that we would get really down to just subjective opinions of people's experiences rather than really trying to figure out what Lewis is pointing out here. But I think it is a good exercise for anyone to try. Take some time to look at the characteristics of the omnipotent moral busybody and the robber baron. How do they play out today? How do they rule over other people? Do people around you exhibit any of these qualities? And how easy can it be to do that? So Lewis gives us a couple of differences why one is worse than the other. He says the robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, his cupidity may at some point be satiated, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience. I haven't personally been under the control of a robber baron in the way the term suggests, but I have seen the omnipotent busybody that arrogantly approves of oppressing others for their own good. I see it play out a lot in political discussions as well. All too often, someone will say they believe in freedom or liberty, and they're also very quick to advocate for very oppressive laws to keep people from acting in ways we don't approve of. And it really does stem from this sense of piety that we have. This piety has been manipulated for a long time in this country, and why America, with Justice for All has experienced alcohol prohibition and the war on drugs and an endless list of blue laws. I say it's manipulated because with just a little research, you can find someone or an organization that has directly profited off of prohibitions, but they need the pious majority to rally behind the laws as a crusade for righteousness. And it's usually the Christian piety and the Christian crusade that I'm speaking of. I think this sort of manipulation has been used quite a bit with the church. And I would even say it's people or companies that can be described as robber barons that have really utilized the omnipotent busybody to raise their funds or to rise in power and to stay in power. This piety is what Lewis references when he says in the next line, they may be more likely to go to heaven. This sort of works-based faith and salvation is all too prevalent in the American church. And as the church has conflated the state with itself and then the citizens of the state with God's chosen, it really leads us to his next comment. Yet at the same time, likelier to make a hell of earth. When I think of hell on earth from the results of the pious busybodies, I think of a few examples. I think of a child abused by their parents for not being perfect or holy. We have examples of families that have literally killed their children in the name of God to help them become more pious. I also think of the majority of non-theist or atheist that I've met, and even my own experiences while I called myself an agnostic, that was usually rooted in some experience of an adult saying one thing about God or their faith and acting another way that we easily knew was completely contradictory, and they were hypocritical. I also see this hell on earth from the omnipotent busybody in what we call American exceptionalism. It started at this westward expansion that justified killing those savage natives that didn't do what was best and assimilate to their civilized colonists. So they needed to die by the gun or starvation or be moved to a reservation. But it also plays out today as we remake the Middle East in our own image. This sense of American exceptionalism, it's still here today. It just kind of plays out in a different area of the world, really. And the disregard is always the same. They should have done what was best for them. I see the hell on earth play out in the war on drugs as well, locking people up for their own benefit. And if they die resisting, so be it. They should have done what was right or what was best for them. So Lewis says, this very kindness stings with intolerable insult. I completely agree. To be cured, he says, against one's will and cured of states which we may not regard as disease is to be put on a level of those who have not yet reached the age of reason or those who never will. It really is the height of arrogance that Lewis is referring to, placing ourselves on the level of God's knowledge and using this knowledge to harm others for their own good. And this reminds me of a common phrase I heard growing up in the South, a justification of enslaving Africans, that it was better than living in the uncivilized African brush, or we shouldn't release them after generations of captivity because it was better for them to stay under a master's rule. They couldn't handle freedom. It clearly falls into the categories that Lewis gives when he says they are classed with infants, imbeciles, and domestic animals. This is the reality of where we place ourselves in relation to others. And though it is common in the church, it isn't Christ-like. God himself came down to all of us. He is the only one worthy of the feeling of omnipotence and the only one fit to judge. Yet he came to show grace on the infant and the imbecile and the wretched. So I think it is important to evaluate Lewis's words when we encounter those philosophical, political conversations of should the government do this or should the government do that? Are we making a hell on earth for people? And how does it compare to what we know we're supposed to do? To love our neighbor. Is being an omnipotent busybody loving your neighbor? No. It's insulting and fosters generations of hatred in both parties. Are we making a Judeo-Christian caste system when we try to fix scoundrels through legislation? H.L. Mencken once remarked, "The trouble with fighting for human freedom is that one spends most of one's time defending scoundrels." This is something Christians should consider. Not pursuing a scoundrel doesn't mean that they aren't scoundrels. It doesn't mean you must approve of their lifestyle. But we must think about what we make ourselves when we do this. We make ourselves omnipotent busybodies and make hell on earth for our neighbor. And it is simply not the Christian thing to do. Lewis led off the paragraph from this statement in the essay, and it's another important note that I think sums up our examination of what we should be doing. He said, "My contention is that good men, not bad men, consistently acting upon that position, would act as cruelly and unjustly as the greatest tyrants. They might, in some regards, act even worse." Well, I hope you liked this episode on C.S. Lewis and something he called the most oppressive of tyrannies. If you did, please like and share on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or iTunes. Leave us some ratings and reviews, or think about supporting us through Patreon. I'll also have our Amazon affiliate links up and running for some of the books that I mentioned, and they'll be in the show notes. So if you're interested in picking up any of those books, please use our link. It will give us a small commission through Amazon, but no additional charge to you. So until next time, grace and peace, no king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.